Right. Well, hello, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'll wait a minute as we allow a few other people to join the webinar. I'm Kate Tellerico, and I am a housing reporter with the Bay Area News Group. I'll do a little bit of housekeeping here. So we have a Q&A that we will be doing after I ask a few questions to our panelists. Our audience members can hop in on that, ask any questions, and there's a Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom that you'll see. And if, as we're doing this panel, any technical issues arrive, feel free to ask those questions in the chat, and someone from the Bay Area News Group team will be there to help out. I'm super excited for our panel today. We have a great set of panelists. We're going to be talking about California's housing crisis and how it's really become a national issue, and California has become a thought leader in this space. So just again, if you have any questions for our panelists as they're talking, please feel free to put those in our Q&A. We'll get to those at the bottom. So we wanted to do this panel now because housing has been an issue that really has been talked about mostly at the local level. I think for years, you had people all across the country who are looking at skyrocketing home prices in California and saying that's a California problem. But now it's really become a problem everywhere. And even these places that were once really affordable are now seeing home prices just go nuts. So a little bit about me. I came to the Mercury News last September to report on housing. But before that, I was reporting on housing in Boise, Idaho. And Boise is one of these small markets that used to be super affordable. When I got there in 2018, the median home price was $250,000. But by the height of the pandemic, it had more than doubled to $520,000, which is crazy. And as I was reporting on the housing crisis there, in a way, it really felt like I was already reporting on California's housing crisis, because that was a huge driver in prices. You would have Californians cashing in on their houses here, buying big homes and all cash in Boise, and that was pushing out a lot of the longtime residents there. And you'd get folks with bumper stickers saying, "Go back to California." But really Californians were this convenient enemy to designate when really there was a whole host of structural issues impacting housing prices, which is what we'll get into with our housing panelists. So now that every city in America seems to be dealing with an affordability crunch, we're seeing housing policy get elevated to the national stage, especially on the presidential campaign trail. So we've seen Kamala Harris proposing to build 3 million units during her term. During the DNC this summer, Barack Obama came out as a YIMBY, a term that you've probably heard, meaning yes in my backyard. And he also talked about undoing outdated regulations to allow more housing to be built. And even Donald Trump has talked a lot about reducing red tape when it comes to building housing. So what's interesting to see is that some of the policies that have been thrown around at a national level are really coming out of California. So I think that when we talk about housing at a national level, you can't do it without acknowledging the ways that California has been such a thought leader in this space. So we'll get into all of that with our panelists. And now would be a good time to introduce them. So first off, we've got Sarah Karlinski, who's the research director at the Turner Center for Housing Innovation. And her research focuses on advancing housing affordability and sustainable neighborhoods. We also have Jillian Pressman, the managing director of YIMBY Action, a pro-housing movement that began in the Bay Area and we'll talk about has expanded and really built a nationwide movement. And we'll talk to her about how YIMBY Action has been building these pro-housing coalitions around the country. And we have California Senator Nancy Skinner, who has served as chair of the Senate Housing Committee and spearheaded several bills designed to spur housing production around California. So my first question, I'll direct to Sarah, but anyone can hop in. I mentioned that the affordability crisis that we're seeing play out across the nation is a result of several structural issues within our housing market. So I was hoping that you would be able to talk about why California in particular has felt the affordability crunch so early on and why those affordability issues are now spreading to other parts of the country.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much, Kate. And I'm so excited to be here and just to be on this panel with so many wonderful panelists and people that I admire. So thank you for having me. In answer to your question, I think the simplest way to think about it is that we have a structural deficit of housing. So we have for many, many decades added more to our population than we've grown in housing units. And so that creates housing scarcity and drives up the cost of housing. I think the reason for the housing scarcity is complex, but a lot of it has to do with land use and kind of our land use structures in the state of California. So California is what's known as a home rule state, and what that means is that each individual jurisdiction, up until actually very recently, given things that have gone on the state legislative level that I'm sure Senator Skinner can speak to, local governments have basically had near total authority for zoning within their boundaries. And what that means is basically, you know, if a project comes in or there's a plan for zoning, it's the local city council that is deciding, you know, whether or not to let housing move forward. And there's a lot of pressure on that city council to not let enough housing be built because people have concerns about housing. They're concerned about, you know, height of the housing or whether it brings traffic. And there's just an incredible amount of pressure on the local elected leaders to not allow there to be, you know, zoning for apartments or, you know, zoning for, you know, 5 stories of housing versus 4 stories of housing, and on and on and on and on. And so when each local jurisdiction is kind of subject to those kind of that internal political logic, and that's replicated over and over and over again, what you end up with is just not enough housing because there's not enough zone capacity for the housing, meaning there's just, you know, you can't build apartments of a certain height or size. And then there's all this process funny business that happens as well where you know, if let's say a developer brings forward a project, there's opportunities for mischief using the California Environmental Quality Act to stop or delay a project, and as that continues and proliferates in more places, there's just less housing being built. I will say that particularly in coastal parts of California, there's been sort of very strong job growth historically over many decades. And as that job growth has continued, when we fail to build enough housing, then it creates this mismatch and the scarcity. So that's really kind of a California problem that's been in the making for many, many years. I'm summarizing a lot in hopefully a very short period of time. But I think as other places have either been seen as sort of more attractive because these coastal places, it's not just California, it's, you know, Boston and New York. There's kind of pressure on secondary markets, which you yourself described and your experience in Idaho. And so you start seeing some of these spillover effects. And as when COVID happened and people could basically move anywhere, you saw that that spatial distribution magnify. So I think these are some of the reasons why California has the dubious honor of being first and worst in terms of our housing crisis, but also why there's been a lot of innovation here. So I'll just stop there for now.
Kate, if you don't mind, I'll jump in. I think it was Sarah gave a good overview, but let's get a little bit higher up for a minute because it's more than many years. We're talking decades. So you look at when there was a big housing boom in California, it was after World War II with the GI Bill and such. And what was the focus? The focus was building single family homes. Okay, great. Everybody wanted a single family home, but single family homes are the least efficient form of housing for using land. But for the population size we had, it was okay. But in the process of now, and I used to be a Berkeley City Council member. I'm now a state senator. I represent Berkeley, Oakland, Richmond. But Berkeley has the very dubious distinction of being the founder, the home of exclusionary zoning. And we think of zoning, we think of, oh, well, zoning's smart. It's our cities being smart and thinking about where best to put, say, industry or retail or housing. But in fact, zoning's purpose and zoning was developed to exclude certain populations from being able to live certain places. So Berkeley's exclusionary zoning, which only allowed for single family homes, but within those single family homes would not allow Chinese American families to move there. And ironically, most people think of our racism in housing being focused primarily on African Americans, on Blacks, but Berkeley's was first designed at the turn of the century around stopping Chinese Americans. Eventually, covenants, and this happened all over California, in communities all over California, there were covenants put into place into the single family zoning that excluded any AAPI, Asian Americans, Black Americans, and Blacks, period. And of course, in certain communities, also Latinx. So this exclusionary zoning explains why then, over time, 80 to 90% of the land in California that's zoned for residential purposes, and we're talking the entire state, is zoned solely and only for single family homes. And because of that, the state had to step in. And it is, just as Sarah pointed out, it is local governments who do that zoning. So there's lots more I could say about that, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah. And I think, our housing policy in general tends to focus on zoning the most as the solution to increasing the housing supply, because there are a lot of other factors like these macroeconomic factors, right? Like in particular in California, we get this huge housing crunch because there's been so much job growth, and this like huge tech sector job growth.
Yes, but that's even with the job growth. It is really because we have not built. Let's be just really upfront. When I moved to Berkeley in 1972, you couldn't find a place to live, and there wasn't that kind of job growth. It's because they would not allow for the building of any kind of multifamily housing. In fact, the city of Berkeley voters passed something called the Neighborhood Preservation Ordinance. What was that? To allow only single family homes. So when you allowed no density, no ability to do triplexes, fourplexes, and we're not even talking about big apartments. We're just talking about what used to be the normal pattern of housing, say before World War II, which was the duplex or the fourplex. That was banned in most communities up and down California. And when you didn't build like that, you had a housing crisis. So it's much more than the recent job growth. Let's be real. And then, of course, the other thing that factors in to US in general, but California also, is that we've allowed housing to be primarily financed by the private sector. There is, of course, some programs like under the federal HUD to provide some subsidy for affordable housing, but you cannot get affordable housing without some subsidy. So if you're expecting the private market to build affordable housing, which is what we expect, you have to let them build more in order for them to finance it. And that's what we've restricted. You go to other parts of the world, and I recommend anybody who likes to travel, go to Vienna, and you will see that their practice is they don't look at what they call social housing as a negative. We call it public housing. They call it social housing. They look at housing as something critical for every resident. And they basically require almost all housing built in Vienna to be social housing. So people of all kinds of incomes live in what we would consider subsidized housing, and they don't have a housing crisis. So that's another interesting factor.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we'll get more into like affordable housing and that sort of thing as we talk about some of like the ways that the federal government could be a leader on housing policy here. But, I wanted to go back and talking about the Bay Area's affordability concerns here. This comes from zoning, this comes from us just not building for so long. At the same time as there's just been like a huge demand in the Bay Area. And that's where like, in the early 2010s, we see sort of this like YIMBY movement being formed. So I wanted to throw a question towards Jillian. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how like a pro-housing movement gets started in the Bay Area and how it's grown into this more national movement.
Yeah, so hi, thanks for having me and good to see y'all on the call. So YIMBY, we started just about 10 years ago, and we came from really the personal experience of what this problem looks like for us and for our families and in our homes. And so many of you may relate to some of these personal experiences. Many of us were really, really struggling to pay rent. Really, really struggling. If we were lucky enough to be able to have a home, really, really struggling to afford that home. And it was a huge stretch. Many of us are young people who came to the Bay Area recognizing that this is like, maybe it's the most amazing place in the world. Maybe it's the most amazing place in human history in terms of just the innovation and the opportunity and the art and the culture, the amazing nature. And we wanted to be part of it. And we found that to do so, we had to make really, really big sacrifices in order to live here. And we had to live in with 6 different roommates, and we had to live in housing that has mold in it, and we were getting sick. And we had to really, really stretch to make that rent check every single month. And if it wasn't us personally, it was family members. So we also consisted of, older members who, maybe they were in a house and like that actually, they were able to make it work for themselves, but their children, grew up, wanted to live nearby, wanted to live in the neighborhood, wanted to live in this beautiful, amazing place, and absolutely couldn't. So they could live with mom and dad for a little bit until you kind of get sick of that and you're kind of like, okay, you need to stretch your wings a little. And these are people often who have good jobs and are doing everything right and are just really struggling. And then you add to it, the really, really extreme and catastrophic pieces of this, which is our homelessness. And, not one of us on this call can escape what is happening, the humanitarian crisis that's happening with homelessness on our streets. It's everywhere. We see it everywhere. And there are people who like full on, it's not even that they have to suffer and stretch to afford housing, they full on cannot afford housing. And so we see that and we're appalled by that and we want to do something about it. So that's the personal experience that drove the YIMBYs and that continues to drive the YIMBYs across the country. And then I'll also say kind of, the flip side of it and what started the YIMBY movement is we recognize that there actually was a solution to this. And the solution is let's build more housing so that we actually have more housing opportunity, that we don't have to live in that mold infested apartment, that we can have other things that we can choose. And then, if you actually look at the studies, and so, many of us saw, in our neighborhoods, even when new apartments open up, there's more opportunity, there's more places to move, it creates competition, it lowers the prices. And there's actually, that's backed by the research too, that housing at all levels, if you add supply, it really improves the affordability. So that was something that we were excited about. And then we're also excited, just, one other piece on this is, sometimes in this conversation, we talk about neighborhood change and neighborhoods changing and, building new housing. A new housing project is proposed and it used to be, I don't know, an old bowling alley, but now it's new housing and that's a change for the neighborhood. A lot of us were seeing change happen in bad ways because we're not building enough housing. So we see the neighborhood getting older and older. We see fewer and fewer kids living in the neighborhood because families just flat out can't afford it. We see our children's favorite teachers are moving away. We see the fire station has a shortage of firefighters. We see the homelessness go up and up and up, and areas where it's, maybe a little encampment is now becoming a huge encampment. So the neighborhood change is happening anyway. And what we wanted was, how can the neighborhood change happen in maybe positive ways, where actually maybe, yeah, we changed that bowling alley into housing, but that also means that families can move back in, and that teachers can stay, and firefighters can stay, and our homelessness goes down. And, and also the other things that happen when you have vibrancy, you're able to, coffee shops spring up and artists start doing things, and people walk around and you can say hi to your neighbors. And, it has trickle effects into transit and biking, which I won't even get into, but, maybe a bus stop opens, and maybe you're able to, institute a bike lane because there's that level of density. So we saw the positive examples. So want to kind of root it in the experience. What actually happened is that our early founders, had all these experiences suffering under the housing shortage, recognized that housing could be built and should be built and would really help our neighborhoods change in positive ways. And so we started actually showing up to where housing was being proposed. And what we learned is, when we show up to these meetings where housing was being proposed, most of the people that show up are people who are against the project. And all the people who feel the way that we do and want to see more housing and will benefit from having more housing, and might even, be able to live in that new housing if it actually was built, they're not there. They're not showing up to there. And some of that is just kind of how the process is. You sort of have to make a notification to your nearby neighbors, but you don't have to notify the larger community that would benefit from the housing. Some of it is just kind of how the incentives work. Some of it is just the population that would benefit from new housing tends to be, younger and more transient, and less, it's a little more challenging to organize them. But that was the reality. And so we started showing up, and we started saying, like, actually, let's be the voices of yes. Let's actually show up to the housing project hearings and say, yes, in my backyard. Yes, we want more housing. Pretty quickly, it started kind of as one person showing up, and then it was 2, and then it was 4, and then it was 8. And then pretty quickly, we had a little mailing list of activists. And today, actually, YIMBY Action is 67 chapters in 27 states. We have about 65,000 activists across the country. And that expanding has been the same exact process. It has been folks in, Arlington, Virginia, or, Austin, Texas, or Huntsville, Alabama, who say, we're experiencing housing shortage. Maybe there's some sort of triggering moment, there's housing being proposed, and they say, oh, we want to support this, and we need to organize other people to come out. It can't just be us. And so they connect to us, and we help get them set up and help them build a chapter so that they can do this work sustainably. That's the basics of how we're started.
Yeah. And, I think, like what you're talking about, you go into how housing really is this thing that's decided at the local level, at the city council level, at this sort of smallest level of government. And one of the things that California has been trying to do in increasing the housing supply is to, present more opportunities to be housing to be built by right, rather than to have to go through this lengthy approval process. So this sort of transfer of power on housing decisions from like the local level to the state level seems to have been happening. So I want to talk a little bit about like why we're focused at the state level when it comes to housing policy. And maybe Senator Skinner, you could talk a little bit about, why is it that the state is sort of like the level at which we can intervene here? Oh, I think you're muted.
Right. Okay. I think a lot of us in the legislature, we saw this need. We saw this the numbers that the state's housing department, and also the federal different numbers from HUD and others, about that we were not keeping up with supply. And interestingly, I saw something in the chat where someone's mentioning that, California had its peak of building permits, say in 1986. Well, and so that, housing shortage is not real. In 1986, California's population was 27.1 million. Today, it's 39 million. So that's a growth of 13 million people in that period of time. And if that's when we peaked, and and not really, if we look at the numbers, has much housing been built since. In the last couple of years, growing numbers. But basically, what the legislature was looking at is we were seeing that even with laws like California had, the Housing Accountability Act, where it was expected that whether you were the homeowner or a big developer, whatever you were, it didn't matter, that if you submitted a permit and you felt you played by the rules under the Housing Accountability Act, the city was supposed to process your permit. But instead, we were seeing up and down the state many, many mechanisms that either residents or the local governments would use to basically delay that housing or block it. And delay, of course, has the most cost. And interestingly enough, it was the affordable housing projects that experienced the longest delays. They were taking 10, 15 years just to get approval. And by then, of course, the cost to build it was so much more. So the legislature started acting. There's a variety of bills. I did a bill in 2017, SB 167, that strengthened the Housing Accountability Act, that added some fines and some teeth to it. And then in 2019, I went further with a bill called SB 330, the Housing Crisis Act, where basically I said, look, if somebody has submitted a permit that plays by the rules, if you met that city's zoning codes and various things, then it should have a limited number of public hearings. It didn't mean don't exclude the public, but a limited number of public hearings, which could tweak various aspects of the design and such. But then the council, the city would have to approve that housing. So you would have some confidence, whether you're a homeowner or a property owner building, say multifamily or something, you would have some confidence if you submitted an application that played by the rules, you would be able to get your permit in a timely manner. And that bill has had a huge impact on many, many forms of housing being able to get through much quicker. And as I indicated before, time is money. So it's also allowed, if it takes too long to get a permit, all of a sudden the housing can't even pencil out and it costs so much more. So those were some of the actions, and there were, of course, many more. We can talk ADUs later. ADUs have been the real success story in California, the largest single sector of housing being built in the last, say, 3, 4, or 5 years.
Right. Yeah.
Can I just say a couple of things? I absolutely agree with what the senator said, and SB 330 has been a real game changer. I just wanted to give, it'd be helpful for people to hear like an example of how hard it can be for a developer to build a project. So I used to work for a affordable housing nonprofit called Mid-Penn Housing on the peninsula. And this was prior to my time, but I won't name the jurisdiction, but basically Mid-Penn was gifted a parcel of land by some nuns to build affordable housing. And the neighborhood went absolutely berserk. They accused Mid-Penn of engaging in a papist plot because the nuns had provided the land. They made Mid-Penn redesign the project like 2 or 3 times to fit in with the historic context, which all had been built in like 1987. They basically said that they didn't want, quote unquote, those people living in their community, to go back to what Senator Skinner was saying about kind of racism driving a lot of this context. And then it was only when my then boss threatened to sue the city under federal fair housing law that they relented. The entire thing took years and years and years and years of process, tons of pressure on the city to just mess with the project and basically just drag it out. And when you see that happen over and over and over again for affordable housing or otherwise, it's really no mystery why the state legislature wanted to, step in and try to deal with some of these problems.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. And, all of those years that affordable housing is not being built, or, just years that people are going without that housing. And yeah, I think like I said before, going back to just that like local level, being the decider on this, that's where you get the state wanting to intervene and pass some housing by right. And you talked already about the Housing Accountability Act, ADUs. If we wanted to go into that, that's one of the things where, by the state, by making that by right approvals, has really expanded the number of ADUs. Last year, 1 in 5 of every new homes built in the state of California was an ADU. And so it seems like that has been a pretty successful program. And now you see like other states are looking at California's success and shaking loose some housing supply, and they're moving to pass similar bills. So like,
Yes.
for example, last year in Montana, which is a very different state than California, right? Republican majority legislature, but they signed a housing package as well that now allows a duplex anywhere a single family home could be built. California did similar legislation a few years ago. They also legalized ADUs around the state. So I was wondering if you all might be able to talk a little bit about how California has been acting as a thought leader for other states when
Certainly.
it comes to housing
Well,
policy.
before 2012, there was maybe, the data showed that permits for ADUs were maybe 800 a year statewide, 800. Now they're over 25,000 a year and growing in number in terms of pulling of permits. And the legislation to make it easier for people to do an ADU on their properties was first started by my colleague, Senator Bob Wieckowski. He's termed out now. He's no longer a senator, but he did the first bill, I believe, in 2015. And then subsequent to that, Assemblymember Ting from San Francisco and myself, we've both done multiple other ADU laws to make it easier for people to build ADUs on their single family property. And in effect, in some cases, not all, but in some cases, make it by right. And we've seen this incredible growth, which is wonderful. And so I hear all the time from residents of my district who now have their elderly parent living on their property, or they have their kids in a separate unit. Before their kids were living in the house, but the kids wanted to be independent but couldn't afford, as Jillian pointed out from YIMBY Action, they couldn't afford to live anywhere in the Bay Area. So their families pooled the resources together and built a separate unit on the property so that the family can live together. And it's incredible. It's wonderful. So that's what we're seeing a lot of.
I can jump in on that too. So, like I said, we're in many states, and many states are also dealing with their own housing shortages. In every corner, it's really, I have not heard of a city that is not experiencing housing shortage at this point. It has really, really exploded. A number of national factors, but also, migration patterns and things in the pandemic and all of that. And there are some kind of hot policy trends across the country. So ADUs is definitely something that many states are looking at. The missing middle housing, some of the small like duplexes, sixplexes, sometimes that requires single stair reform. So changing some of the building code to actually enable some of these small apartment buildings. One really exciting policy is the Faith in Housing, or YIGBY, Yes in God's Backyard policy, that enables faith-based organizations to build affordable housing on their land, which is, really amazing. There's tons, especially across the American South, which is experiencing a huge population increase. There's tons of churches, there's tons of land on that churches, and often the congregations really, really, really want to build affordable housing because they really want to be able to serve their congregations. And unfortunately, they can't because the process is way too onerous, and they're, they're church people. They're not in the business of fighting for 10 years to get a project through the permitting process. So we were really, wonderfully in front of the trend here in California, passing a YIGB bill, SB4, and it's been really exciting to see that picked up across the country. So we definitely, like other states, are looking to California and are saying, okay, if California can do something, then so can we. One of the things that's interesting to point out, what California has is it does have some really positive implementation aspects that, Senator Skinner's SB 330 is a big part of this, where there is a state bill that requires localities to take action to implement it. California has, it has HCD, it has a Housing and Community Development Department with an enforcement arm to make sure that cities implement what they have to do. So we have a whole housing element process. I don't know if we'll get into that, but there's a whole housing element process, and HCD oversees the housing element process and ensures cities actually go through and do their housing element rezonings. We also have a really good enforcement landscape where independent housing organizations have a right to have standing to enforce housing law, which has been really powerful for us at YIMBY. And, it's still not perfect. There is a lot of really good state law that does not get turned into actual homes because the implementation piece needs to be worked out. And that's something that I know Senator Skinner, again, your colleagues are thinking about a lot, is how do we close that gap? But it's also something that other states hopefully will start emulating and start recognizing that we need to pass these policies and we need to think about what's going to put them into action. So I think that's a really exciting policy landscape.
We have to give a big thanks to Governor Newsom, because the state has always had the HCD, the Housing and Community Development, and, for example, the Housing Accountability Act was first passed more than 20 years ago in the, I believe it was the early 90s. And yet the state wasn't really holding the local governments accountable for their decisions. And Governor Newsom has. And of course, that's made some local governments not happy, but it's appropriate that that's the purpose of that agency. And so Governor Newsom has done a great job with, in fact, having the enforcement part of our housing laws be active and hold those local governments accountable.
Yeah, I think, as we talk about all of this, we're talking about sort of what different states can do in following California. But, what I wanted to talk about more largely is, is there anything that our federal government can do, that could be a more broad approach to housing supply? I think, a lot of the housing affordability proposals that we've seen are more focused on the demand side. So for example, Harris recently laid out her housing plan, and she proposed giving $25,000 in down payment support to first-time home buyers, which helps the buyer to afford a home, but they're still dealing with
expensive houses.
Crazy home costs, super expensive homes. And that's not really doing anything to help the supply issue. So, are we going to see housing policy be this sort of like piecemeal state by state thing, or are there places that the federal government could play a role more, particularly on the supply side? And I'll throw that question out to
Sarah probably can answer some more broader, but I think going back to the issue I raised about affordable housing needs subsidy. It's just the nature to build housing in California or anywhere. It's expensive. And so for it to be affordable for a renter or an owner to pay less than market rate, it needs subsidy. And the federal government used to play a much bigger role. Well, that was a long time ago. I mean, it's been since the Reagan era, the amount of money the feds have put into housing in general has gone way, way, way down. But it would be great to see that increase. So that's something that, if our, I hope, President Kamala Harris had the appetite to provide more funding for affordable housing. And, if we get back to the issue of homelessness, I would love to, because the interesting thing is, since the pandemic, California has not increased in population. The Bay Area has not increased in population, and yet we've increased in the number of homeless people. So there we see that we have, yes, there's still a supply crisis, not enough homes, and we have to get more housing to address it. But we have some other factors. And those other factors are things like this growth of short term rentals, whether it's Airbnb or something else, and also this growth of people not having to go to work. So maybe they originally lived near a downtown where their job was, but then they were allowed to work remotely. They held on to that unit in the area where it was close to work, but then they got another unit elsewhere. So they have in effect two residential units, but they're not living in them all the time. So those are some of the things, not all, but some of the things that are adding to our homelessness problem now since the pandemic.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
so go ahead, Sarah, and let's get back to, what is the federal government? What can they do about housing policy?
Yeah, well, the senator is absolutely correct that providing funding for affordable housing, providing funding and resources for people at risk of experiencing homelessness is absolutely something that the federal government can and should do. But I think in terms of just land use regulation, which I think is part of your question, it's a little tricky and it kind of goes back to the Constitution of the United States, where basically all powers that aren't enumerated in the Constitution are then reserved back to the states. And so it's not like the federal government can say, you states shall all zone in thus and such a manner. And then states in turn often will devolve still further to the local government. So I think, pardon the little legal digression, but it's actually important to understand how all of those fit together. Nevertheless, there are absolutely things that the federal government can do. So first and foremost, in addition to providing direct funding or subsidy for affordable housing, the federal government can also condition its funding on states or local governments making certain types of zoning changes. So all the, transportation dollars that go out that all the states really want very badly, or other sorts of federal funding that for infrastructure that go out that the states and local governments want very, very badly, the federal government could say, we're not going to give you this money unless you upzone near your transit stops, or we're not going to give you this money unless jurisdictions, do away with certain types of zoning and then allow for apartment buildings on their commercial corridors. Like there's some conditioning of funding that the federal government may be able to do. It's just one thing. Second thing is looking at the tax code and looking at what we subsidize via the tax code and what we can and should subsidize via tax code. You talked a little bit about how Vice President Harris's proposals rely a bit on providing tax credits to certain types of developers for certain types of development. That's absolutely true. So there are ways of kind of using the tax code to incentivize certain types of behavior that we might want to see, is another area. And then there are other things that the federal government can do. The federal government can hold up examples of what it wants to see and socialize those examples. They can use the bully pulpit to say this is the type of thing that we want to see. I mean, President Obama saying he's a YIMBY in the debate between Vice President Harris and former President Trump. The first thing that Vice President Harris talked about was housing and like the cost of housing and the need to do something about housing. So I think using that bully pulpit is another like very, very powerful tool. And there are others, but those are some of the, I think, biggest levers that can be utilized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think mentioning that bully pulpit tool is really important because, it's also in a way what we've seen in California too. Someone in our Q&A asked, how has housing element enforcement actually happened? what's going on here other than the governor putting out a lot of press releases saying that he's cracking down on various cities. But when we talk about just that role and using that office to put pressure on localities, like that could be something that we see emulated at the federal level too, with more pro-housing candidates. So I think that's interesting. And I'm wondering though, like if, Democratic candidates maybe make themselves the party for increasing housing supply, or the pro-housing party, I'm wondering if that makes housing a more polarized issue. And if like increasing the housing supply becomes labeled as like a Democratic position and maybe makes it less of a bipartisan issue the way that we saw in Montana or something like that.
Yeah, I'll just jump in on this and then, oh, sorry, Jillian, you go ahead.
No, go, Sarah. You've got a good idea. Go for it.
Okay. I just was going to say, I think there is a risk of that, certainly, and that's something that we've heard. I mean, so far, I think at the federal level, housing has been seen as somewhat of a bipartisan issue, or like there can be bipartisan support for certain types of reforms because they're seen as beneficial from both sides. So I think there is some concern about that, but I do also think as housing becomes an issue, it's become a national issue. It's again not just sort of very hot coastal markets, and so representatives do have to deal with housing affordability challenges in their districts, and so and that doesn't respect party lines. So I think there is a concern, but I think there is also an opportunity for bipartisan thinking on this topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Jillian, I'm interested what you have to say too, because the YIMBY movement has succeeded in being quite bipartisan.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think anything that's a federal issue definitely risks polarization, and that's just the reality of our federal dynamic right now. I do agree with Sarah that, if there was any issue that everyone agreed on, it might be that having a home is a good thing and homelessness is bad and people should be able to afford their housing. So there's a lot of opportunity here in a way. That's actually one of the things that draws me to the YIMBY movement, is it feels like very refreshingly big tent that a lot of people with different opinions and maybe would disagree on other things can come together as YIMBYs. But I would say also that, the policy landscape is, and, Sarah mentions in the legality, this still is something that's generally dealt with at the state and the local levels, and that continues to be true. And so when it comes to like the real policy work that's going to make change in a positive way, it's going to happen at those levels. And there are states that are experiencing a housing shortage. You mentioned Montana, but we're also doing work in Florida and Georgia and South Carolina and North Carolina and other areas that are red states. They're experiencing a housing shortage and they're taking arms against that housing shortage, and that generally means a bunch of Republicans are doing it, and they're using different messaging. So on the Republican side, the property rights piece is really big. I should be able to build an accessory dwelling unit on my land because it is my property and I should be able to do that. There's also kind of economic dignity and, the thriving businesses, and the fact that there's businesses that can't sustain themselves because we don't have enough customer base. And so we need to, build the vibrancy of a community in order to sustain those businesses. So there's maybe slightly different arguments, but the issue is felt across the political spectrum, and their solutions across the political spectrum. So I think it's about, continuing to do the work where the work needs to be done. I'd also say that the state by state solution, on one hand, it might be piecemeal. On another hand, it's much less piecemeal than doing it locality by locality. We at YIMBY believe we absolutely need to do it by locality and by state and by federal government. Like, we need all of them. But what we've seen at the state level is there's a really big contagion effect, that there's legislators that are, we're working a lot in Virginia as an example, and there's legislators that are seeing what's happening in California, seeing what's happening in Montana, and saying, ooh, I want to be the guy who brings housing affordability to my state, and I can do it by getting behind these bills. And, you know, oh, California just passed a YIGBY bill. Let's do a YIGBY bill here. Let's make this happen. So there really is a contagion effect that can happen, and a state-by-state solution, I think, is really possible and viable on this issue, and exciting, and also will, I think, inherently just be more bipartisan because of how our states are structured.
Well, interestingly, one of the national organizations that's most active in the pro-housing space is AARP, the American Association of Retired Persons, and they are active all over the country and active in California. But if you look at the housing laws passed in California that have been really promoting and green lighting more housing, and even I don't mean even, but also with the focus on affordable housing, those laws have been bipartisan. We have gotten Republican support. When we focus solely and only on affordable housing, we get less Republican support. But in general, our bills have been bipartisan. That's the way the votes have gone down, which is great. I was looking at the Q&A, and I was seeing some comments, for example, about, you know, aren't ADUs just, haven't they just been used for Airbnb and such? Well, the data that HCD has been collecting is indicating that certainly there are people with ADUs that are using them just for short-term rentals. But what we've seen is that more than 55%, it was close to 60% of the ADUs are being used by family members. So this is up and down the state, Los Angeles area, Bay Area, that the ADUs being built end up being used or, you know, housing family members, which is really great news. And it means that is more missing middle housing, or in some cases, affordable housing. If it's one of your elderly, you know, family members who is living on a fixed income, you're probably the owner of the property who built the ADU is subsidizing then that person. But that's the data on our ADUs. And then there was a question about Prop 13. How has Prop 13 affected all this? And none of us have brought it up. Prop 13 has had a definite impact. And the definite impact is that because your property taxes more or less get frozen, you see up and down the state, many people living in much larger square footage than they need. So as you get to retirement age and you're in this, you know, wonderful house, but you don't really want to, you know, keep maintaining it, but you're paying the property taxes back from the 70s or the early 80s, you can't afford to move, even though you can transfer your property taxes, but you can't transfer them to a property that costs more, and your house maybe came up in value so much. So Prop 13 has really impacted, but we're seeing ADUs being one thing that person sitting on so much house that they don't need, they can, you know, convert it into a duplex for that matter. People might not think of an ADU as a duplex, but that's what the ADU law allows. So it's helping that somewhat, but Prop 13 has that an impact. And then hedge funds and what's called REITs, or I don't know, the real estate investment trusts, they're also affecting our housing market because they're buying up. They started this after during the Great Recession. In the foreclosure crisis, many of these hedge funds bought up in certain communities lots of single family homes and then sat on them and then waited and are charging outrageous rents. So that is affecting our housing crisis also. And some of those hedge fund single family homeowners are leaving properties vacant and just waiting until the market changes. And again, that is not helping us. So various of us, I've introduced laws to try to limit those hedge funds from being able to play so big in the single family home market, but not so far the legislature, they've not been open to putting limits on them. And I hope that other legislators keep focused on it because it is a serious problem.
Yeah, in the chat, there's definitely quite a few people who are concerned about how investors and private equity have been impacting the housing market, you know, in California in particular. And, you know, you talked a little bit about some of your efforts in the California legislature, and I thought I would mention too that there have been some national policies mentioned around trying to rein in corporate landlords. Kamala Harris has said that she would push the idea of limiting rent hikes to 5% for landlords who have over 50 units. So that's something we're seeing. There have also been proposals to ban algorithmic price setting softwares like RealPage. And that's, again, a policy that sort of started here in the Bay Area. I think San Francisco was the first city to ban price setting software, and these softwares that allow landlords to see what other folks are charging for apartment units. So that's one thing on the investor front. Let's see.
There's some questions about enforcement.
Yeah,
Is it helpful to touch on that quickly?
please.
So enforcement, sometimes enforcement, the way that it looks is that the state will pass a law. So SB 35, which is was then redone as SB 430, is one example where it requires for certain cities, low-income housing has a streamlined process. So the permitting process is a lot shorter, which can reduce permitting time literally from 10 years to 6 months. It's really, really huge for getting online that low-income housing that we need. And states or cities are required to do that. It's a state law. And then sometimes cities won't do that. They will say, well, this particular project, it actually doesn't apply. This law does not apply here. And variety of reasons why they say it doesn't. My favorite was there's a not to be named city in Southern California that said, oh no, this area is for horses. This is an equestrian area. We don't have people here, so we don't need to build low-income housing. So the one way to enforce that is to actually get, housing organizations have standing in California to be able to enforce that law. And so we can actually file suit and we can say we are community members who are harmed by this law not being followed. The law was supposed to be followed. It was not. And so we're filing suit. And that is one way to, and that does have a ripple effect where, if you do win a case, it sets precedent locally. If you win an appeal, it sets precedent across the state, but it also really creates a deterrence effect. So that's one mechanism enforcement. The second one I would mention is with the housing element process. Won't go into the details of that. There's lots to read on it, but basically the state requires cities to make local plans to accommodate their housing need and then turn those plans into local zoning. This cycle of housing element, it's, the numbers are really big. Places like San Francisco, it's 82,000 homes. Los Angeles, it's 400,000 homes. Like there's really big requirements. The cities have to make their plan, turn into the rezoning, and the HCD oversees it at the state level. But there's a lot of the enforcement work usually looks like having people on the ground that are telling the cities, hey, let's work together to create a housing plan that's compliant. And then also telling HCD, hey, this is where it's happening or it's not happening. So we have a watchdog program that does that. And actually what's exciting about housing element law is it does require low-income homes to be built, very low-income homes all the way up, and actually requires something called affirmatively furthering for housing, which is low-income homes being built in different areas. So we can enable low-income housing in, near parks and near transit and near jobs and near social capital and near all the things that we as Californians believe is a right for low-income people and for all people. So there's a lot of opportunity with the housing element, but it does need that on the ground people watching it and implementing the housing element. So those are a couple ways enforcement plays out, and you can definitely learn more at yimbylaw.org if you're at all interested.
Thanks, Jillian. One other question that I wanted to get to that was asked very early on in the Q&A is, as we're talking about housing supply, we've mostly talked about changing existing city zoning in order to allow more units to be built. And someone asked, well, why not just expand city limits horizontally or build in nearby sister cities? And I'm wondering if someone might be able to speak to that, like why isn't that a more viable solution to increasing supply?
I can, I'll let the senator answer.
Yeah,
no, you go ahead.
Sarah, please jump in. So I'll look at the East Bay, and we have those of us who live in the East Bay We are so fortunate. Look at this ring of regional parks that we have, administered primarily by the East Bay Regional Park District, this incredible open space. And that open space allows for some people who, maybe don't, whatever, they don't love the density as much. They have right next to them, within, even walking distance in most cases, either one of the bayfront parks or some of the parks in the hills where they can get out and be away and feel just transformed. And if we thought that our answer to our housing supply crisis was to just start building into, for example, those places that we've preserved as open space, it kind of runs counter to that need that we have for those natural and open spaces. Additionally, let's look at the issue of the climate crisis. The closer housing is to where jobs, services, schools, all of that, the better it is from the climate point of view. People that live close to where they need to go shopping, where they need to go to school, where they need to work, have a much lower carbon footprint by and large than people that live further away. And even when we get electric vehicles, even if everybody has an electric vehicle, there is embedded carbon in all transportation. So having housing really concentrated where there is jobs and services is so smart for multiple reasons. And that's how I would answer that one. And maybe Turner Center's got some other perspectives.
No, I think I totally agree with everything you said. I would just add that actually that has been how we've dealt with our affordability crisis. So we might not have built into our beautiful parks, but then we leapfrog over those parks and go, for example, into the Central Valley. And we've seen a lot of housing get built in low density forms in parts of the state that are kind of less beneficial from a climate perspective. So in the Bay Area, we're blessed with natural air conditioning in the form of fog. In the Central Valley, it's very, very hot. And as climate change creates rising temperatures, you have people just they're living further away from job centers, and they're living in parts of the state that are more dangerous from a health perspective. So you may have people that have to commute 2 or 3 hours in their private vehicle to get to work, and then live somewhere that's much hotter and basically more dangerous.
Mhm. Yeah, and I'll just add that while people are, in a more affordable location where their mortgage payment might be lower, they're being saddled with, other ways that they're paying, whether that be the longer commute or transit costs or those sorts of things too. Well, let's see. I think that I want to wrap up there. This has been a wide-ranging discussion, and I'm super grateful for all of your perspectives on housing. We like doing these newsroom at home events, and we do them on a variety of subjects. So if you have any questions or suggestions on what our next event should be about, you can send an email to theevents@bayareanewsgroup.com. And we hope to see you at another one of these events shortly. I want to thank again our wonderful panelists for your great insights on housing. And there's so many questions that were in the chat that unfortunately we didn't get to, but I report on housing all the time. I've gotten a ton of really good ideas as well for some of the things that our readers are concerned about that I want to report on further. So this is just the start of the discussion. Thank you all again so much for joining this discussion on housing. And hopefully we'll see you at one of these events soon. Thanks to our panelists again.